morning. Hello, everybody. A very warm welcome to everyone for joining this webinar. This is a webinar series being jointly organized by ADB and the Wildlife Institute of India. And the topic, as you can see on the screen, is on greening transportation projects. And so this is a series. There are 4 webinars in the series. And we already had the first webinar on 25th November, and the topic of the first webinar was on why connectivity matters, and it also touched upon models for ensuring connectivity for a specific species of wildlife. So today, we are going to be talking about mainly the kind of mitigation measures that goes into ensuring that the linear infrastructure has adequate eco-friendly features integrated in them. So that's one aspect. And the other aspect, which is very important, is the capacity building needs that are required, particularly within the government agencies and the contractors, for ensuring that these mitigation measures are properly integrated in the infrastructure project. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping reminders. So please note that this meeting is being recorded, and I request everyone to please have your mic on mute unless you need to speak. Later we will have a Q&A session. And if you have any questions, you can either submit your questions in the chat box or you can raise your hand. So we will have a dedicated Q&A session later after the 2 presentations. And we can also take 1 or 2 questions in between the presentation of our 2 speakers today. So next slide, please. So the agenda today, it's pretty straightforward. Actually, we will have mainly 2 speakers. We will first have a presentation from Dr. Fraser Schilling. Sorry, I think someone muted me. So we will have a first presentation from Dr. Fraser Schilling. He is the director of the Road Ecology Center in the Institute of Transportation Studies in the University of California. We have then, after Dr. Fraser, we could take 1 or 2 questions. And then after that, we will have Dr. Mathur, who is the chairperson of the National Biodiversity Authority in India. But before that, Dr. Mathur was the director of the Wildlife and Ecology Department. I think that's what it was called in Wildlife Institute of India. I think without any further delay, we should probably get on with the first presentation. And again, just requesting our participants, if you have any questions, to please start posting it in the chat box, and we will take 1 or 2 questions after the presentation from Dr. Fraser Schilling. So Dr. Schilling, may I invite you to please share your knowledge and experience in green linear developments. Over to you, Dr. Schilling.
Thanks very much, and I'm very honored to be part of this, both this webinar and also the series. I think it's really an important thing that you're doing. I'm sorry about the lighting. It's very dark outside, and so all the lighting on me is from interior artificial light, so it's not ideal. So I'm going to share screen, and we're going to see if this works. So can everybody see the beginning of the PowerPoint slide? Okay, so I'm going to go to the full screen, and then we'll confirm that worked. That work?
Yes, looks good.
Okay. All right. So I invite anybody who has questions to put them in the chat as instructed, and we'll also take some more at the end. I'm going to be talking about decision support for improving wildlife connectivity with transportation systems. Most of what I'll talk about is related to roads and highways, but you can think of this as also related to rail and potentially other kinds of infrastructure, linear infrastructure as well. So I'd like to acknowledge a variety of people who've worked with me or worked for me in the past. The people at the first row, they're from UC Davis, graduate students and undergraduate and technician. I've had support from the National Center for Sustainable Transportation, the Pew Charitable Trust, Caltrans, California Department of Transportation, and the US Department of Transportation. I'd like to thank several consultant engineering firms for their contributions to my thinking and also some of the graphics. And finally, Winston Vickers at UC Davis and Clark Stevens, who've helped me in Southern California mountain lion projects. So what's the problem that we're trying to address? And there's different ways we can think of transportation impacts. One of them is the very visual, the very striking impact of large infrastructure that you might see in very developed countries or large cities in all countries. Another way to think about it is on the bottom left, there's a map there of all roads in the world. This is from Lawrence et al. 2017. And where the roads all run together, it creates kind of just a black blob, but it does indicate that there are very few large wild areas or unfragmented areas in those areas that are gray or black. And so you can see in Southern Asia, most of Europe, Eastern North America, and other parts of the world that we are very roaded. So we have lots of roads, and many people say we have too many roads. And then on the bottom right, you can see for an individual road. And so the individual road, I'm going to see if I can get the pointer. Let's see. Can everybody see a pencil moving on the screen? A white?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, so at the center of this map, there's a highway running through, and the dark color here, the dark color indicates noise coming from the highway, but you could think of it as light or pollutants. And so around every roadway, every highway, there's also what we call a road effect zone extending outward away from the road. So all of these roads over here on the left, they also have this road effect zone, which exacerbates the total impact of highways and roads and other infrastructure on the world, on natural systems. Oops, I lost my ability. There we go. So another way to look at the problem is at the very local scale, where animals are killed on roads. And this is the primary way that a lot of us think about road impacts or on wildlife, because it's a very visual type of impact. And a lot of discussion, including some of my discussion, will be about connectivity, which is about wildlife moving across areas, including across roadways. But one of the other big impacts is when those animals are killed. And if I was to compare those, I would say that those are roughly equal types of impacts. When you get very roaded, very trafficked areas, the amount of wildlife killed is probably at least as important, and probably in some places more important, than the fragmentation effect. So keeping animals off the road becomes really important. In order to support decisions about wildlife and transportation, we need a wide range of information. Some of it is going to be engineering, traffic volumes, the road or rail geometry, how does it fit in the landscape, the morphology of the land itself. What is the road sitting on top of a ridge? Is it sitting in the middle of a valley? And those are going to have quite different effects on natural systems. What's the surrounding land cover? What type of habitat, vegetation, plants, and quality of that for wildlife? And then finally, what species are present? Which are the ones that we're really concerned about? And which ones are dying on the roadway or the railway? Which ones are moving around in the vicinity? And potentially some of the animals moving around are safely crossing roads and linear infrastructure. And finally, wildlife connectivity. And this is more of an abstract concept. It refers to real things that are important in ecology, but it's not measured as directly as, say, where wildlife are occurring. So how do we gather all this information together? And one way to think about it is a workflow like this diagram. And this is a very simplistic way of expressing some of the things that you might want to think about, or one would want to think about. And the first box here, it says, what type of decision or need do you have? Is it a new or expanded transportation infrastructure? Is it mitigation for wildlife impacts that you're concerned about or other kinds of impacts? Is the mitigation you're thinking about structural? In other words, are you going to build something, fences and crossing structures? And then also, do you have special habitats or heritage species that you're really, really concerned about, or that there may be some international or national listing if it's an endangered or threatened species? Then the next step is the mitigation itself. And the word mitigation actually includes the idea of avoiding impacts in the first place. And I'm emphasizing this because one idea that's prevalent, that's really common, is that no matter what kind of transportation we build, we can always mitigate the impact. And I would say that's absolutely not true. Definitely in the more developed parts of the world, we've built transportation infrastructure that we cannot mitigate the impact of. It's just too big, there's too much of it. And so one of the steps to consider is just avoiding having the impact in the first place. Once the next step is taken and transportation infrastructure or other infrastructure is going to be built, then placement of the mitigation is a first important decision. Where's the impact going to be? Therefore, where are you going to place your mitigation in order to try to avoid or minimize or offset that impact? The type and timing of mitigation is important. If it's a built mitigation, the timing is less important. But if it's a different kind of mitigation, for example, closing roads at certain times of year, or closing roads or reducing speeds altogether, then the timing is going to be important there. And then there's two types of benefits that we need to think about. One is what species and processes are benefiting, and identifying those is really important, because that's going to give us the support we might need politically or in terms of funding to build some kind of mitigation in the first place. And then where we have more information, we can start to think about the economic and ecological benefits in a different way. And I'll show you an example of that. And so if you have a species that like elephants, for example, that have a tourism connection, then you definitely have the potential for an economic impact of when the elephants are dying on roads or when you're trying to protect them on roads. The third step, there's really three steps. The first of those is construction, and design of crossings is not something to be taken lightly. This is not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. There's really a couple of things to think about there. One is that for some things, you can cut and paste them across the landscape. So, for example, building over crossings everywhere is probably a very good idea. But if you can only build two, then you want to make sure that they are accomplishing as much as possible, and design is going to be very important in that. Costs are obviously critical for being able to build more than one. So for example, in California, we have the Liberty Canyon Wildlife Overcrossing, which will cost approximately $87 million US when it's finished, which means that it's equivalent to probably 30 other crossings that could have been built somewhere else in California. And then installing or deploying the mitigation, the construction of it is obviously a critical step. And as quickly as possible is really the key here. The sooner that something can be built and deployed, the sooner the benefits are going to start being incurred. So something that's a 10 or 20-year plan for the future obviously is not giving you the benefits of something you build now. Then two really critical steps here at the end: maintaining. So not everything will stay upright, like fences, for example. Vegetation management around a wildlife crossing is very important. And who's going to do that? How often? And how much will that cost? Very important to build this in the beginning of a project. And finally, monitoring. Was it effective? Was your action, did it accomplish what you wanted? Or maybe it accomplished something else in addition. So that's really good to find out. And planning for that and paying for it is really critical, not just building things and walking away and assuming that it's all going to work. And then that final step helps you inform decisions in the first place. So if you find out what's effective at the end, of this process, you can use that as part of your decision-making at the beginning of the workflow. So here's some of the information that we use or think about using in structures, building mitigation structures or roadside animal detection systems, whatever you want to use. And one of those is thinking about traffic. This just is a chart of vehicle miles traveled in different states in the US during the pandemic last year, during the shutdown, we're still in the pandemic, during the shutdowns of the pandemic last year. And that's just showing several things. One is that there's oscillation in traffic. And so if you're doing some kind of mitigation that depends on when traffic is high versus when it's low, then you would want to know that timing. And also that different times of year, you might have different traffic volumes. And a characteristic of traffic that's very important for design of mitigation is what is the fleet. The more trucks or motorcycles you have in the composition of the traffic, the noisier it will be, and the fewer wildlife will actually approach the mitigation structure in the first place. Another important characteristic, which is more difficult to control or do anything about, is the geomorphology or the shape of the land. And this example, this shows a 3D model, elevation model of the Liberty Canyon Wildlife River Crossing. And you may hear about that again in the next part of the webinar series. So this is a land bridge that's being built across a very wide highway. I think this is 12 lanes of traffic. And the structure here is about 100 meters long and 50 meters wide. And so the shape of the land around it is really critical to understanding how effective it might be. For example, the approach area, all of this area where animals would come down to get to the bridge is all facing the traffic. And so they're actually exposed to the traffic noise and light the entire time that they're approaching the bridge. And being able to control that is really important. And it's possible to do that in landscape design to improve the use of the structure. Another is land cover, and that includes what kind of habitat, vegetation, special habitats, for example. And so the map on the right is showing, it's a little tricky to see what's going on here, so I'll explain it. The red dots are wildlife vehicle collisions. So these are places where crashes occurred between large wildlife and cars or trucks. And sometimes it results in an injury or damage to the vehicle. The places that are orange, so orange or yellow, that indicates that there are higher costs, crashes in those places. And so we actually can give value, we can ascribe value, economic value to those. So if we do a mitigation in those places, then it's going to be better. But the other colors here, the brown color, the pinkish color, the blue, they may indicate special habitat types. And then you can see in the background, there's this green. This is all forest towards the right. It's evergreen forest, montane. So this is the mountains. And on the left, it's lower elevation. And these are grasslands and shrubs and woodlands, hardwoods. So understanding the vegetation surrounding the area will give you an idea of what wildlife might live there. And then wildlife mortality, and this is a really common way of looking at wildlife impacts of transportation. And I'll just show you a few maps here. But you can see on the bottom left here, these are all of the data we have for California. There's about 80 or 90,000 points there for different categories of animals. We know the species for all of these points, but I've just put them in these big categories. And so at this scale, it doesn't really tell you much except that wildlife are dying everywhere. When you zoom in, obviously you can get more detail about which wildlife are dying in which places. The middle map shows the cost of all of these, not all of these crashes, the crashes with the large mammals. And you can see the scale here goes up to $100,000 per mile per year, US dollars. And at the lowest level, the light green, we have less than 13,000 US dollars per year. So you can see that there are a lot of roadways where we have expensive crashes where people are getting killed or injured or vehicles are being destroyed. And on the far right is another way of thinking about wildlife vehicle collisions, and that's for special species. And this is showing mountain lion and black bear, which are two species we're concerned about in California. Wildlife movement across roads and through crossing structures not much is known about how successful animals get across the top of the road, so on the road surface itself, but we know a lot about how wildlife use crossing structures. And these are all different crossing structures from different places. And quite often you'll, even a small structure like the one on the bottom left here, you'll get animals moving through. And a lot of it has to do with whether or not there's traffic nearby disturbing their movement. Another way of thinking about wildlife is connectivity, and quite often we have connectivity models. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail with these, but this is for a publication that's going to be coming out hopefully next spring. Basically, we looked at different connectivity models, linkage models is another term for them, in California, and we found that none of them correlated with where wildlife are moving. So what that means is that we don't have a good way of predicting where wildlife are moving. And these are well-known models in California, and none of them are effective in telling us about wildlife movement. So I wanted to get into a little bit here at the end into design, and I brought up the Liberty Canyon Wildlife Crossing structure, and that's the show.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Dr. Schilling, I know you said you're close to the end, but just wanted to let you know if you could please finish in the next 3 minutes or so.
Yes, yeah, I'm
Thank you.
I'm right at that point. Okay, so one important thing to do in implementing and constructing is to make sure that your structure is going to be effective. So the top left here, this is showing the a typical way we would build a crossing structure, which isn't any consideration of the surrounding landscape. And what we've done for the Liberty Canyon crossing is designed a way for wildlife to get to the crossing structure in what we call dark and quiet paths. And basically, we just moved earth around virtually in order to create these dark, quiet paths to get to the crossing structure. And this is an example of what one might look like in California. This one doesn't exist. This is a design of it. This is basically a picture of one put into a real place. So the background is the real place, and then the structure is the potential design. And this kind of approach is really useful for communicating with people. What's it going to look like? And then potentially, how well is it going to work? And wow, right on time. By the way, this is a mountain lion, and thanks to Winston Vickers for this video. And anybody who wants to contact me after this webinar, please feel free to do so. My email address is right here on the slide, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Schilling. That's a great video closing, ending your presentation. Yeah, so it's really interesting to, I have also been working in this field for many, many years, but it's interesting to hear particularly about the cost, the vehicle-wildlife collision. And I think that is a part where in Asia we struggle, where we need to, first of all, collect the data on how expensive it is to, when we have these kind of collisions, and then to communicate that to the decision makers and to try to justify, why it's worth investing in having these structures. So I think we have some questions. I thought I saw questions. Yes, there is a question. So we have a question from Suva. So I think we can take 1 or 2 questions before we move on to Dr. Mathur. So Suva, would you like to speak up and ask your question? Or should I just read it out? It would be nice if you could just speak up and ask your question.
Thanks, Karma, and good morning, everyone. And thank you, Dr. Schilling, for the very interesting presentation. I had just one question because in the past, we were working on a road project in India, and it was basically involving the widening of a 2-lane road project, in which the road was actually in proximity, actually in the vicinity of a critical habitat of an avifaunal species, of a bird species. So it was always, I mean, I didn't continue working on the project, but it was always a challenge for us to understand that how in case of a linear project, we actually, first design the monitoring methods, monitoring mechanism for birds, and also in terms of other mitigation measures which can help us in preventing the bird kills, especially
Yeah.
because birds are more of, aerial creatures, and in where you find such a critical habitat, then that's the place where we have a challenge.
Yeah.
So that
No, I
was
absolutely agree with you. And there have been some strides made in that area. One approach for larger birds is to put vertical poles up along a highway. It's like a fence, but there's no mesh in between because they don't want to fly into the poles, so they'll tend to go up and over. Another simpler approach is just to plant vegetation that if you're in your agricultural area, for example, so birds that are soaring, they're flying along, they will go up over the vegetation and over the road. But the one that's probably the most sophisticated is similar to the bat bridge idea in Europe, and I forget where it is exactly, I think in Germany, or France. So there's a bat bridge that funnels bats that are, you see them going back and forth in this one area, so they put a bridge over, and the bats actually go right over the bridge. And so it's prevented a lot of bats from dying when they fly onto the road. I want to quickly take one of the questions in chat that relate to noise levels, since I brought up noise. Oops, it just slid down, so I'll go up. And there are a lot of noise thresholds are set to human standards, but we have a lot of information about noise impacts on wildlife in the literature. And we have some thresholds we can use, such as 55 dBA, decibels A-weighted, is probably a very good one for most wildlife as a maximum noise you want to get to. So when we were doing our design project, we were trying to meet some of those thresholds for wildlife behavior. Karma, I'll turn it back over to you to decide if I should answer more questions.
Thank you, Dr. Schilling. Yeah, that's a very interesting question about noise, because we are always concerned about the noise that's disturbing humans, but we forget that even the wildlife, and in fact, they have the ability to hear even sort of lower levels of noise. Well, we do have another question from Vivi. I think let's take this one question and then we will move on to Dr. Mathur's presentation. So Dr. Mathur, if you can please hold on a few more minutes. So this is a question from Vivi Tutti. Would you like to ask your question verbally, Vivi? You have put it in the chat, but would you like to ask it yourself? Okay, maybe we could just take it from the chat box. So I think her question is about the design and mapping of animal build head like dog, cat, dolphin, or tiger.
I'm not sure how to read that.
Yes. Using game for animal in every country and to grow population.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the question means, and it's unfortunate that everybody has to ask the questions in English. I'm sorry, I don't know, any useful languages for you to be able to ask it in your native language.
Yeah, maybe we can try to spend some time to digest the question. So perhaps we can move on for now to Dr. Mathur's presentation, and then we can come back to that point after we spend some time trying to understand what the question is.
Sounds good.
So thank you, Dr. Schilling, and we will get back to you during the Q&A session later. Okay, Dr. Mathur, over to you.
Thank you, Karma. Can you see my screen and can you hear me?
Yes, we can see your screen and we can hear you.
Sure. Thank you so much for providing this opportunity. I want to draw the attention of this learned audience to the title itself of my talk. And as you can see, I'm talking about some perspectives. That's very important for today's discussion. We have heard Dr. Fraser, the biologist, the wildlife conservationist, talking about the connectivity and related issues. I must share with this audience that our journey into linear development started 20 years back at the Wildlife Institute of India. And interestingly, 20 years back, we just wanted to know what is the road-induced mortality as far as wild animals are concerned. So we wanted to take up a project 20 years back, and we were advised that road-induced mortality is not an issue. There are far more greater problems in wildlife conservation and ecology and behavior which need to be studied than to spend time and effort in looking at mortality, kills, and so on and so forth. So that was, I must say, a little disappointing, but we never gave it up. So that started the story 20 years back. We started looking at projects, we started looking at data, we started looking and talking to our biologists. Fortunately, the WII has a team of wonderful biologists all over, and we started gaining that what is these issues are, what kind of impacts are we talking, can these impacts be mitigated, and what needs to be done, and who needs to do what. So that is a little background on what I'm going to present in the next 15-20 minutes, looking at why mainstreaming of linear infrastructure is important, what kind of ecological impacts are there, and what are the principles behind mitigation. Because a lot is being said about mitigation, but we need to get the basics right, that what these mitigation principles are and how do we need to follow the mitigation hierarchy. We heard Dr. Fraser saying that avoidance is the first step. Undoubtedly, there is no question on that. If we can avoid an impact, we must. So there is a whole series of mitigation hierarchy which needs to be looked at when we start talking of linear infrastructure development. And then we need to talk how do we move ahead from that. So just we have a learned audience undoubtedly, but these linear infrastructures are something which are required for promoting economic growth. They provide mobility, they provide deliveries of goods and services, commerce, industry, trade, tourism, everything is linked with infrastructure development. So they definitely are a very important feature of the economic progress of the country. But at the same time, many of these developments, many of these highways, roads, transmission lines, canals, they also pass through areas where we have large mega biodiverse species over there. Tigers are there, elephants are there, bustards are there, and these species get impacted because of the infrastructure development we take place. So then coming back to the stated philosophy which India is trying to move ahead, that we need to mainstream. And that is to understand that modifying larger development strategies is possible, should be done, but we need to incorporate the goals for both development and conservation. In other words, we are looking at development which does not include destruction. And at the same time, can we also have development with design? So this is the key area. This is my urge to all my biologists over here, that with our knowledge and experience and expertise and interest, can we design development which helps in conserving and in also meeting the development needs. So then two words come up. Everybody knows smart. So what is a smart growth and what is a smart conservation? So this is something we come across when we meet the administrators, when we meet the policymakers, when we meet the politician, because his idea of growth is it should be smart growth, and our ideas of conservation is that it should be smart conservation. So now the challenge is, can we have both? Can we have smart growth? Can we have smart conservation? And what would that smartness entail? What kind of efforts are needed? What kind of evidence-based knowledge is required? And that is what has been the experience at the Wildlife Institute of India for the last 20 years or so. We started very clearly demonstrating that the first thing which a linear feature does is to cause fragmentation. So if you build up roads, if you build railway lines, they bifurcate the habitat, cause fragmentation. Obviously, with the fast moving traffic, there are issues of mortality that I mentioned. All kinds of animals are getting knocked down, from avifauna to reptiles to birds, mammals, elephants, tigers, and so on. And then, of course, there are these fringe effects which take place because of the ancillary development which occurs along with the infrastructure development. So there are issues of pollution, there are issues of growth and urban growth and urban development and so on. And finally, people are asking that, yes, what is the real effect of infrastructure development? Colleagues of mine like Bilal and others have been working for years now in trying to demonstrate that there is certainly a manifestation of a barrier effect. How it manifests, what it does, how it regulates species, and how it varies from species to species is also a matter of great concern. So these are some of the workflows which Dr. Fraser was talking. We need to develop them. We need to demonstrate them, that these are the kind of situations where fragmentation and negative impacts of infrastructure development come into being. Very simply put, you can see impacts at a glance. It could be fragmentation, it could be pollution, it could be edge effect, it could be invasive species, it could be road kills. So we are now talking of a range of impacts which we have to contain with, which we have to deal with as we start developing our infrastructure over there. This is a very interesting graphic representation by a very eminent scientist, Rodney Vanderlee. He presented this to explain that how this manifestation of overview of impacts takes place, how mortality occurs, how barrier effect starts into playing, how animals themselves look at avoidance, and how and what features of the habitat need to be integrated, because we are now talking of a landscape level conservation effort in dealing with green development. Obviously, models are important. We need to model them. This is a very famous study by Jagir looking at what stage these impacts start visible. How do wildlife populations start depleting? What we need to do first? How does connectivity or reduced connectivity leads to species extinction? So these are some of the models which have been created over a period of time, and that's very important, that we need to continuously invest the science-based conservation efforts over there to look at the relationship between the population sizes with the period of time over there. I mentioned to you about mitigation principles. It's very, very important. Interestingly, a large number of people are talking about mitigation. And as Kama mentioned, the first webinar that we did, we looked at the issues of connectivity. And connectivity is very important. So connectivity is the key. But what I want to share with my colleagues today is that context is very important. Many of our colleagues, our decision makers, our politicians are traveling to US, to Canada, to Africa, to Australia. And they look up at things over there. And then they say that, yes, what is possible over there, we need to do it in India. Yes, we can. But context is important. Species are different. Sites are different. Context is different. So therefore, my plea is that when we start looking at the principles of mitigation, the connectivity becomes important, the context becomes important. And nothing works except hard evidence-based science. So all our land use theory and practice has to be grounded in science so that we can develop a framework for growth. We can come up to the politician and say that, yes, this is what you need as a smart growth. It's possible, but we need to develop a framework following the complete principles of mitigation hierarchy from avoidance to restoration. As we also talk of capacities, where are the capacities of the land agencies, the national highway agencies, the rail agencies? We looked at a number of guidance, and I'm sure all of you are familiar with these guidance manuals which are available now off the shelf. A huge amount of literature is available. There is no doubt on that. But there is still, we felt a few years back, there was a need to look at all these guidance material. Why? Because people want solutions. As we often say, you can be a part of a problem, you can be a part of a solution. So we need to definitely be a part of a solution. And therefore, we need to look at all these areas, how to sensitize the developers to plan, to implement, to pursue development. And at the end of the day, I have large number of colleagues in this audience who are actually practitioners, who have a mandate, who have a responsibility, and they want to know how is that to be done, how to achieve a smart growth, how to develop a smart infrastructure. So this how-to thing is something very important. And in India and in the rest of the countries in the South Asian region, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, the highway agencies, the rail agencies, the power agencies is what we looked at. And we came together with a guide, which you can see. It's available online, high and low resolution, which talks about a new best practice guidance, which looks at how to mitigate the impacts of linear infrastructure. When we started the development of this guide, obviously there was resistance, there was reluctance, but with constant effort, with reaching out to our transportation planners, to the road engineers, we were able to understand them that what is their requirement. We were able to articulate with our biologists that what kind of scientific data and evidence is required in order to plan these structures. And that is where now we have this guide before us. So the big question now, as we deal with this ADB project on natural heritage, on natural capital conservation, what kind of country capacities are needed? We need scientific capacity to generate data, to generate information about species that are likely to get impaired. And obviously, the nature engineering solutions have to be planned, have to be designed. We are also talking to our engineering institutes. Many of our engineering friends have studied civil engineering, but can nature engineering be a part of the civil engineering curriculum? That is where we need to reach out. That is where we need to open out. That is where we need to foster convergence. That nature engineering is something we need to learn a lot from nature. I am sure in the coming webinars, my colleague Dr. Asha and others would be talking about what can nature teach us and how these principles of nature can be applied in actual building of the infrastructure. So what is the way ahead? I want to raise a few points to this audience that we need to make use of the best available science for planning. Our questions and our solutions are difficult because we need to be species specific on one side. What is true for elephant is not true for tiger, and what is true for tiger is not true for bustard. And then we need to look at site specific because mountains are different, coasts are different, deserts are different. In all these places, we need to find out both species specific mitigation measures. We need to look at site specific mitigation measures. So what is the answer then? We need to collaborate. We need to coordinate. And I must say to many of my colleagues here that most of the development or infrastructure development or the linear infrastructure development that we are talking is a case of upgradation. There is already a two-way highway existing. The government wants to make it 4-lane. There is a 4-lane existing, wants to make it 6-lane. So there are two situations. One can have a design de novo, that here is a plan that we need to construct a 6-lane highway, and we can have the best of designs and mitigation principles built into. But in reality, we are dealing with retrofitting. The existing highway is there, 2x4, 4x6. There are limitations regarding alignment. There are limitations more so in case of rail projects where you cannot turn the railway line as per will as one would do that. So we are what is called as a fait accompli situation, that our choices are restricted, our options are restricted, and that is where we need to have a greater level of indulgence and scientific efforts to ensure that we are able to work out a nice retrofitting solution and to respond to situations which are there. And that is where these guidance tools are very, very important. So moving beyond best practice guidance, as I said a few years back, that was the thing that we wanted to do. We have done it. We are working on it. But there are a range of issues now coming up. We need to train the stakeholders. A large number of stakeholders are involved. Everybody needs to be sensitized. What is the issue? What is the challenge? How to go about it? What will be the cost? What will be the design? We need to also train the decision makers and regulators, because they are the ones who have to take an ultimate decision. And what is the scientific basis of their decision making? Many times when the road projects are getting sanctioned or authorized, we do provide a mitigation plan. But then the question is compliance of the monitoring happening or not? Because this is now a very important issue, because if we do not comply with what we have proposed, if we do not monitor what we have proposed, if we do not look at the effects of these things, then we are not doing a true and a proper job. So compliance monitoring in case of infrastructure development is a very, very important issue. It needs to be dealt at various levels, at the level of policy, at the level of law, at the level of science and conservation. And then finally, this is my last word here, we need to look at continuous investments. Mind the word investment is something different than expenditure. So all this effort that ADB and WI are now doing in building up this area of concern is to ensure that we provide technical resources, we provide financial resources in the larger issue of natural capital conservation and the smart green infrastructure development. Today we are talking with ADB, there is the World Bank, there are other agencies which are also into infrastructure development. We need to bring them all together. We need to look at an overall safeguards policy for conservation, which takes into account the interest of both conservation and development. So that is my plea to all of us here today, that we will need continuous investments. All biologists, all managers, all practitioners, all project leaders, all ADB staff need to come together to pool in their resources and to ensure that the best of technical and financial resources are available. Sometimes, having said all this, I wonder, see, this is a very interesting graphic which you see. The elephant is saying that, am I on the wrong track? Because tracks are very important for elephants. Karma knows that in the entire Bangladesh story, how railway tracks have been very, very instrumental in looking at the smart green policy development on that. So we need to, it's a counter voice I want to say, we need to look at, okay, are we on the wrong track? Are our policies correct? Are our approaches correct? And then only plan the best possible way on mitigation over there. And lastly, science is all about knowing, but engineering is about doing. This is one important thing that I've learned in 20 years, that science is important, will remain important, but we need to bring both science and engineering together. Then only we will be able to work out a lasting solution to our problem. We need to have projects which have a longer duration because the impacts are not easily known. And therefore, we need to work out a strategy of convergence, of coherence, of complementarity. If these three things come together, I am very sure we are going to chart out, and we can be assured that South Asia leads the example of developing the smart green infrastructure and catering to the needs of natural heritage conservation. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Mathur. Very inspiring words. And I know we are doing a lot of good work in South Asia and showing example, not just South Asia, actually globally, on some very good practices for addressing connectivity in linear infrastructure. So we have many questions, interesting questions in the chat box. Let's get right to it since we don't have much time. So there was just a comment from Mr. Ravi. I think it was following on the earlier question from Suva on the issue with the birds. And it's quite funny how he was saying that the birds are being blamed for being maladaptive and slow flying. And I know that the Indian bustard, I think poor thing. That's one of the reasons, because it's not a very agile or fast-moving bird. So that's why it's critically endangered now. I think there are only like a few hundred of them left. So we actually need to not put the blame on the animal. We have to accordingly adjust the mitigation measure. It should commensurate with the sensitivity and the behavior of the species. So I think that was just a comment from Ravi. But if we can move on to the other questions, since there are quite a lot. So this is a question from Akansha Saxena, and I think it's directed to Dr. Schilling. What is the best way to get a greater buy-in from infrastructure agencies for installing mitigation measures? This is the greater challenge when attempting to suggest measures. So exactly, that's the big question. What can we do to convince the infrastructure agencies?
Well, you could ask people like me and Dr. Mathur, and we'll speculate because we're both ecologists who work with transportation entities. But I think it's also useful to ask the transportation entities what would convince them. So find the allies and say, what's actually going to work? What's going to work for you? And when I've done that, and my experience is that where you have a safety concern, you are immediately inside their wheelhouse. You're inside a familiar area for them where they understand why that would be a priority. So colliding with large animals would make something a priority. But most people, I would say the vast majority of people, if something suddenly appears in the road, especially at night, the first reaction is often to swerve. And so it really doesn't matter as if an animal is visible and it suddenly jumps into the road, or a bird flies in front of the windshield, somebody might swerve their vehicle, and that's immediately dangerous. So it's not just a collision, it's also anytime animals are running into the road, it creates a distraction that can result in injury. And so both of those are safety issues. I think another way is to call on people's better nature. And it sounds optimistic, but I feel like as more and more ecological crises build up, it becomes easier to open the conversation about trying to solve some of those ecological crises. Because engineers and planners and people financing these projects, they're smart. They know what's going on as well. And so trying to speak to them about these things, I think, is a really critical way to open up that conversation and therefore get buy-in. And any of those of you at ADB, you can tell us what works for you. And I suspect that some of it is reputational. You want to be associated with something that is protective, that deals with ecological crises and doesn't cause them. And I think that that's going to work for a lot of people in transportation.
Thank you, Dr. Schilling. Yes, actually, one of the things that I am thinking is actually to demonstrate the financial and the economic benefits. So I think this is something where we need more data, particularly in Asia. You showed that nice, the map with the figures for the vehicle-wildlife collision in California. So I think we need something similar. And that, I think, like, as soon as you talk about finances, then it automatically attracts the attention of the Ministry of Finance and the Infrastructure Department. So there is another question, and I think I can invite both Dr. Schilling and Dr. Mathur. And interesting, it's about how to avoid and reduce disturbance from light. This is a question from Kanaka Durga Raja Bokipali. So yes, so what do we do about the disturbance from light that is generated by vehicles?
Dr. Mathur, do you want to go first, or should I go?
Please go in first. I couldn't get that. What is the disturbance from light? But please come in.
Okay.
Yeah, the disturbance of light to wild animals from the light generated by the vehicles, like Dr. Schilling was just talking about, vehicles and driving at night. So yeah.
So both Dr. Mathur and I referenced what we call the road effect zone, which is the area around roads that are affected by traffic, the roadway itself, and that extends quite a long distance. I gave the example of noise, and light has very similar properties of propagation, of going through the landscape, but it's not identical. So if you model noise, you haven't necessarily modeled light because they are absorbed and reflect differently. But understanding light and light impacts on wildlife is critical to solving all of the problems that I talked about and that Dr. Mathur talked about, because the light along rail and roadway emanating into the landscape is one of those fragmenting effects that Dr. Mathur talked about. Wildlife don't like light at night. It's not a natural thing. And the intensity of the light is much brighter than moonlight, which is something else you could have at night. So screening the roadway in areas that you think are critical, especially if there's a wildlife crossing you've built, you definitely want to screen it to keep the light from going into the area where the wildlife are coming. There's no point in building a wildlife crossing structure if light and noise is getting into that area and they're really nervous about going there. You know, you want it to work. So screen alongside the road where the wildlife crossing structure is my recommendation.
Dr. Mathur, would you like to add to Dr. Schilling's answer?
See, I just wanted to add, many years ago, we came across a case of a tiger being knocked out by a moving lorry. And as it was trying to cross the road. And we started wondering that how such an agile animal like tiger cannot cross the 6 feet or 10 feet long road and get caught up with this traffic. And then we started looking at it. I don't have a very precise answer, but we realized that it is to do with the structure of the eye. There is an element called zona pellucida. So when the moving traffic light comes on the eyes of the animal gets momentarily frozen. And that is the moment which proves its nemesis. So these are some of the things which we need to study over there. How do we do that? And that's what you remember, that many times when the vehicles are moving on the highway, the lights are painted half black and half white just to reduce that glare. So something to do with that as well. These are some of the things which we need to study at the biological level to see how that manifestations occurs. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that, and it gets back to the earlier question or comment about how birds are criticized for being maladaptive. Wildlife have completely different behavior from us and from each other, and there's no reason to expect that they will have adapted to vehicles. It's like standing on the shore and the tide comes in and you're saying the tide shouldn't come in. I don't want the tide to come in. You know, that's the same thing as saying wildlife shouldn't behave like wildlife. Of course, they're going to behave like wildlife. They have a certain type of behavior, just like we do. And you can't expect it to be different just because you want it to be different, right? So I think it's really, really important to understand how wildlife behave, like Dr. Mathur is saying, and then respond to that. You know, that's when you stand on the shore and the tide's coming in, you respond to the tide. When you're building wildlife mitigation on a highway, you have to respond to the wildlife behavior.
Absolutely. I think that is the thing that we humans tend to forget. So I hope it's okay that we will need to extend the webinar by, I think, another 10 or 15 minutes, because there are a lot of questions and I think it is important, and I hope that's okay with you, Dr. Schilling and Dr. Mathur.
Yes, please, go ahead.
It a bit longer, and our participants, just for your information. So we will try to get through, hopefully, all the questions. So the next one is an important question, and also it's a question which I personally have, is there a cost recovery mechanism to cover the additional investment? So, and if I can sort of twist that question around a bit and add sort of my question is, so you mentioned this very expensive overpass structure in California. And of course, as Dr. Mathur mentioned, it should be context specific. So perhaps we don't need, you know, such massive structures in Asia. So, okay, now we have more information. We have these cost estimates. How do we justify that? How can
Yeah.
we demonstrate that there is going to be a return on that investment to the road department or the railway ministry?
Yeah, it's very challenging. And I'm not sure if your transportation agencies, public agencies feel this way, but a lot of our public agencies for transportation act as if they are a private business. And if they have to spend money, they should see a return to them. But they're a public agency, they're not a business, and the return is going to be to the public. And that's what our economic tools evaluate, is how does the cost return go to the public? We start with the assumption that public transportation agencies should act in the benefit of the public. They make investments, as Dr. Mathur was talking about, into things like mitigation for wildlife. And the return on the investment are things like reduced collisions, benefits to conservation. In the case of the expensive structure in California, that's to protect a population of mountain lions. They're not dying on the road. They are completely separated by this very busy highway. So they are isolated and becoming inbred, and they eventually will go extinct. So that structure is just built for that. It's not built for mortality. There's no crashes that are driving that. So the economic return on the investment is to the public that they don't feel responsible for causing extinction. Very fuzzy, very difficult economic calculation, right? But you can think of it in terms of something like tourism. Tourism has direct economic benefits in some areas. And if you don't have wildlife, especially the big ones that people want to see, you don't have tourism. So if you like tourism associated with wild areas, then you need to protect the wildlife. It's an economic decision. How you divide that up into individual projects is a very difficult thing, but you start with knowing that there's an economic benefit from having the wildlife present, right? That's one way of framing that. The collisions is in some ways a lot easier to do the economic calculation, estimation of what's the total cost from the collisions. And if you reduce the collisions, you get that economic benefit. How does that compare to the cost of building something? Then you have a benefit cost relationship and you can evaluate it effectively. That one's straightforward. The simply having wildlife present and what's the economic value of nature, very difficult, very different.
Yes, it's a very difficult topic. Dr. Mathur, did you want to add something?
Yes, I have a very interesting take on the subject. See, in the initial years, we were trying to stress that mitigation is important. Mitigation needs to be done. People were not agreeing. There was also a question, what mitigation, how to do it, what is the mechanism, what kind of structures. Then came the question that people said that, okay, yes, we can do mitigation, but who will pay? Mm-hmm. And we got totally engrossed in that discussion. Why? Because the project proponents, and please listen, Karma, for ADB, that project proponents were costing the project in a different manner and then adding on the cost of mitigation to it as two different components. And therefore the question was, who will pay for this? From where these resources will come? Right. Now we want to turn around this entire argument that if you can spend $40,000 on construction, you can also spend $4,000 on mitigation. Mm-hmm. And make it 44,000. And then say that what is the viability of the project. So see, right. it is the question of how you are looking at it. If mm-hmm. there is a cost recovery for 40,000, there can be a cost recovery for 44,000 also. And I am very pleased to say, and Bilal is present here, that in a modern state of Maharashtra, in Western India, there is an 800-kilometer corridor being built, where the cost of mitigation has been embedded in the cost of construction. So there is no separate cost. If anybody wants to look at it, there is no separate cost. And that is how it should be. Because we are now talking of conservation, we are talking of natural asset conservation, natural capital conservation, which is the responsibility of the larger society and not just the proponent or the builder or somebody who is engaged in. So we need to educate them, and we need to look at that if cost recoveries can happen for the original cost, then it certainly can also be made for the mitigation cost. So that is the line I want to propose to our colleagues over here, that when we start looking at project formulation, we should be able to get a good sense, and we should be able to factor it in very early on in the project, so that it doesn't come as a surprise, it doesn't come as a something add-on. See, the problem is in construction, it is the add-on thing. The moment you bring anything as an add-on, everybody understands that how contracts get vitiated. Nobody wants to have an add-on after that. So these are some of the ideas which we need to work with the transportation agencies, with donors, with ADB, with others, to look at the whole way in which we approach this issue. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, Dr. Mathur. We need to do a better job of not presenting these biodiversity features as an add-on, as an extra headache to the engineers. So if I can, sorry, now I'm having to select from the questions because there are quite a lot. If we can move to a little bit different topic. This is a question from my colleague, Emma. Dr. Mathur, it's for you. It's on how India can mainstream the biodiversity measures in your guidance into power line projects when Government of India does not require any EIA or IEE to be conducted. Hence, projects are being conducted in ecologically sensitive areas.
See, I will first try to answer it on a philosophical level. And
Sure.
that philosophical level is that, to me, conservation is a trade-off. We gain some, we lose some. And that is where we need to always have the big picture in mind, that we must have an overall idea of how conservation is going to manifest in a given landscape. There are difficulties, there are loopholes, there are legal lacunas over there. The impact assessment process itself needs to be fixed to a very large extent, but we need to find a balance. See, in this entire GIB story, this is being talked about that all the power lines have to be undergrounded. Now, there is a huge cost over there. There is a huge investment to be made. And therefore, we need to look at that what will be the return for investment if certain measures are taken. And see, I'm prepared that in, sorry to say that in this rapidly changing scenario, whatever we can grab for conservation, we must. It could be as low as 10%. It could be as high as 40%. But let's not give up. Let's not be cynical. Let's try to move and say that this is what is possible. If we are able to support and conserve a substantial part of a great Indian bustard population, we need to go ahead and do that. Step by step, through demonstration, through incremental efforts, through success stories, we should be able to weave out a good story for conservation. And I must share with you that the 20-year story of what I've been referring to is a story of positivity. It was not that 20 years ago, but today you take up a project in any part of the country, there is an understanding. And not only that, I mentioned the other day to Dr. Fraser that wildlife crossing plans are now an integral component of the project preparation. There can be no project under consideration if the proponent does not submit a wildlife crossing over plan. One may argue that the plan is not good, it is defective, it is not encompassing everything, but it is required. And slowly and gradually, we will move ahead. And that is where I look forward to my fleet of biologists who are listening to me, that through scientific evidence, through their hard work, through their camera trapping, through their drone surveys, they should be able to demonstrate that where and what action is required. And then the policymakers are then obliged to take that action. Back to you.
I'd like to add to that.
Sure, Dr.
slightly
Schilling.
different.
Very, if you can make it very quick. Thank you.
Okay, sorry. So the $87 million wildlife crossing is that it's important, and the price is so high because we're trying to fix something that we broke a long time ago. And so the cost of conservation will go up as we make these trade-offs. We win some, we lose some, but mostly we lose some. And as you get further down that road, the cost of conservation will go up quite a bit into the billions and billions and billions and billions and billions. So it's worth thinking about it now and not later, because then it's more expensive later. It's not necessarily our problem because we'll be dead, but our kids will be dealing with it. So it's an economic decision too.
Yes, absolutely. And I think we really need to factor about this cost savings by taking these measures now. What are the future costs that we are saving? So we also need to sort of look at it from that point of view. So there are a couple of questions here around the timing. And I'm just going to bundle in, there are 3 questions around that. The timing about, the process of preparing an EIA report. As we know, ideally, we should have at least a whole year's data. So it's time consuming. But on the other hand, most of our government counterparts, they want the project to already start like yesterday. They would have, they want the project to start yesterday. So there is always that time pressure. So how do we manage that? And there is a question around, if it is a new project, can we just go ahead, and are they like a basic set of fundamental rules that we can just quickly incorporate in the design of the project? So that is one part of the question. And another question from another participant is around whether we really need to wait and first have all these mitigation measures, overpass, underpass. Do we need to know all of this information upfront, or are these things which we can integrate into the design as we go along constructing the road? So the timing issue. Who would like to go first?
Dr. Mathur, why don't you go ahead?
See, there cannot be a right or a wrong answer. Fortunately, a lot of information is now becoming available. And if you are a good manager, you will immediately scout for examples, studies, observations which are relevant and try to factor them out. See, a good team of biologists in a short span of time can work out that what is the key issue, what species need to be looked into, what kind of population endangerment are we talking, and then try to work out a strategy that, in one simple word, engagement is the key. We need to engage ourselves. We need to reach out. And that is where I want to again make a very strong plea, come out of our silos. Don't say I'm a biologist, I'm only concerned with this. Don't say I'm a manager, I only need to do this. We need to reach out to each other. Together we can forge out a path of success. And these are not theory that I'm talking. These are small little examples where people have worked together. Good examples of success are where people have engaged each other based on the limited knowledge. It could be data deficiency as well, but it helps you to make a view that where to focus on your effort. So these are small little things which I would urge our colleagues to take into consideration and to engage the local agencies in generating this data in a very simple manner. Thank you.
And I'll add on something maybe less philosophical, more more related to construction timing. I think that if a commitment is made at the beginning that yes, we will absolutely build wildlife crossing as we find out more as we go along. So if it's a 800-kilometer long project and it's going to take 5 years, maybe the crossing design is in year 2 and the construction is in year 3. But conservation is about as urgent as transportation infrastructure is. It needs to happen yesterday. So, it really should start yesterday, just like all the infrastructure projects we're talking about. The way I think you can do that is start with the assumption that if you're in an area with any habitat at all, you probably need some kind of wildlife mitigation. And if you start with that assumption, maybe during the project, you'll find that you need less than you thought, but at least you're not trying to add costs. You've already started with the assumption that you have that cost, you have that commitment, you're not sure exactly where it's going to be, but it's already budgeted as part of the project, as Dr. Mathur said. I think that would be a way to speed things up, but not start the project without any commitment, because then I think it's really just trying to get out of it, trying to get away with not doing it, you know, which is not a great way to go if we're going to do the smart investment that Dr. Mathur was talking about.
Thank you, Dr. Schilling. I'm afraid that we have really gone over time and we do have a lot of questions. So what we can offer from our end to our participants is that we have your questions on record and we can collect answers to your question from Dr. Schilling and Dr. Mathur, and then email the answers to you. So I think that that's one way. Another way is we have the next webinar, which is going to be on 13th January. So if you can also, you know, another opportunity, you will have another opportunity to ask your question. So if you can please join the next webinar, which is on 13th January, and that webinar will focus on natural capital conservation amidst development and the role of governance and in planning conservation friendly and sustainable transport projects. So it's very much intertwined and linked with what we were talking about today. And then finally, the last webinar will be on 10th February. So to our participants, please feel free to register. And I hope our colleagues have taken note of all the questions which are still pending from this session. If we can please organize this and get answers from Dr. Schilling and Dr. Mathur, and send the answers back to the individual participant. So I think with that, I will have to wrap up the session today. It's very interesting discussions, and this is indeed a very, very important topic. Thank you so much, Dr. Schilling. Thank you so much, Dr. Mathur, for your very useful and I think quite practical insights, because at the end of the day, we need to get down into at the practical level, at the field level. So I think we did get some knowledge on that today. And thank you very much to the participants for taking the time to join this webinar. And please join us in the next webinar on 13th January next year. So I will wish everybody a happy holidays, since we are now approaching the Christmas and New Year season. Wishing everybody happy holidays, Merry Christmas, and Happy New Year in advance. Thank you very much.